I do a lot of field surveys in Italy, in central and southern Italy. Have done so since the late 1990s. Before that, I did a survey project in Britain, the Rockstar Hinterland project. And that was my first encounter with the problem of how to record survey information in a way that it can be reused later on in a meaningful way. So I don't want to give away or duplicate the first of my slides. So in a minute, I'll introduce myself further using the slides. But I think it's also relevant that I am the secretary of the IMS group, which is an informal group of survey archaeologists from all around the Mediterranean. I don't know if any of you is a member of that. If you're not, then you can become a member just by letting me know that you're interested. We have two meetings every year, a spring and an autumn meeting with a very free, open program of papers and discussions. So if you're interested, then you can join that. No obligations. And part of the discussions there, obviously, is also on the same topic that SHeRD is interested in. Let's say how to record information and share information in a good way. For example, through by using an ontology. So just to put not to be too boring, put a picture on the first slide of me 20 years ago doing a survey in South Italy, and the typical site record that emerges from this activity. A handful of pottery, so many of you will be quite familiar with this. So there's a whole procedure behind this, of course, and design of the survey itself and protocols that you follow during the survey, let's say field protocol, lab protocol when you're describing the finds, and various procedures for recording things. And what you see here is just, let's say, a very old temporary record of the site catalog, but it shows you that the kinds of things that are important to record once you have decided that something is a site. I'm going to assume that all of you are familiar with this. I'm not going to explain any further about surveying. So I think my drive in looking at ontologies for a survey is that I find it offensive that we are all collecting lots of important data all over the Mediterranean area, but we're doing it in a way that they can be shared, and very often they cannot be understood by other archaeologists than ourselves. So survey data are hugely important in that they have the biggest geographical coverage, the widest chronological breadth, and the largest number of archaeological sites recorded of all possible investigation methods. But this data is in practice not available to heritage managers or researchers because basically we don't pay any attention to data standards. That's the core of it. And some people actually actively resist data standards with the argument that they should be free to conduct research in their own idiosyncratic way. So there has already been a debate in this Mediterranean survey workshop about whether that is a valid argument or not. And I think in the end, we came down on the fact that we don't want to determine how people should conduct their field work, but we do want to determine how people document their field work. So there's been generally some agreement about what constitutes good practice during fieldwalking survey, and a little bit less agreement about what constitutes best practice. But this has had no effect on the actual survey data sets that have been produced or are being produced right now. Even if they have been, this might be an important point, I don't know if this has been already discussed in this group, even if survey data sets have been put in a repository, like we have at ADS in England, DANS in the Netherlands, and now FASTI based in Italy. So the repository obviously imposes some rules about how to archive things, but it turns out that those are not sufficient to be actually able to reuse these data sets. So various people and organizations are attempting to improve the quality of survey data sets in various ways. As I said, there's these repositories that impose certain formatting and metadata rules on what is going to go into the repository. But we tested this, me and a colleague tested this by taking one of these archived data sets and saying, okay, now we should be able to understand everything in this data set, and it turned out not to be true. There were significant things that we could not understand about the data. Other people are not actually trying to conserve and make available the data themselves, but rather they are making inventories at a higher level, at the project level. So we have FASTI Online Survey, which is the successor to the American MAGIS website. That's DePauw University used to maintain that. It has changed now to FASTI. And then we have a new initiative called fieldwalker.org, and they also produce an inventory of survey projects, and occasionally also the data in those projects. But all of this stops short of achieving the FAIR principle of reusability, which is really what it's all about. Can we actually reuse the data produced by all these projects? And that means that anybody who has tried to do large-scale analysis of multiple survey project data has been forced into a largest common denominator approach. So there's a short bibliography, let's say, of people who have tried to interpret multiple survey data projects together, and it always turns out that they have to work with, in the end, they are forced to work with published interpreted site lists instead of the actual survey data sets, because there's just too many problems in the understanding the data themselves or the underlying data. So how did I get into this? Well, I've already said some of this, but actually participating and directing field surveys means that you have to think about how to record things and which things to record. So I have a very long-standing interest in the methodology of non-invasive research, particularly fieldwalking survey. So these are just some of the types of questions that you can have, like for example, what field and lab forms and protocols should we be using in order to make sure that we are recording everything that we need to record? How do you prevent mistakes from being made during record taking? If, for example, like I hope you will agree that it's very important to record visibility factors during a survey, but how do you do that in a meaningful way that those visibility records have meaning for others besides yourself? This turns out to be not so easy. So, and let's say, because many methodological things were simply assumed rather than known, I also conducted a series of field experiments in 2014 to test some of these assumptions. For example, there's something called detection curves. You might be familiar with them if you've read the publications by Ed Banning from Canada. They're basically trying to measure how much archaeological material on the surface you can detect depending on the distance from where you're actually standing. Let's say there is a very simplistic assumption being used at the moment, which is that if you have a field walker, then he or she can detect perfectly everything within 1 meter either side of your walking line. So that means that you have like a 2 meter strip of land in which you detect everything that is detectable. Of course, this is not true. We all know this is not true, but we don't know what is the real situation. So the experiments were to test what people were actually detecting when they are doing a field survey. And of course, these detection curves, they are different for different categories of material, and they are different for different circumstances. If you have a field with a lot of different colored stones, then your detection curves for the archaeological material change. So this is, I think, important work in order to understand what we are detecting and also what we are not detecting during a survey. And this kind of assumption also worked through to the interpretation of survey data, because this is all very old theory of the 1970s. It is assumed that if you have a certain interwalker distance, that then you can be confident that you are detecting all archaeological sites of a certain minimum size. So very simplistically, if your walker distance is 10 meters, then you will detect all archaeological sites with a diameter of more than 10 meters. Whether this is true, again, is doubtful. Anyway, so that's my, let's say, field background. And then already 20 years ago, my interest in standardizing field procedures and documentation started as it became clear that we can't actually understand each other's data sets very well. So in order to further that goal, there are these twice yearly International Mediterranean Survey workshops online for the last year, but generally they are quite well visited. We jumped to different cities all across Europe to do this. Generally, there are about 40, 50 people present during one of these. As I said, we've encountered strong resistance to the standardization of field procedures. I don't know what the experience of your group is in this. And so we decided to focus mostly on standardization of documentation rather than field procedures. Our first attempt to define what is good survey practice has just been published in the Journal of Greek Archaeology. But this is, of course, this document has no status at all. It's just the opinion of a group of practitioners. So it is not a standard. Current work that I'm involved is basically we're trying to attack the problem of sharing and reusing survey data sets in 3 different ways. First of all, there is an actual ongoing project called the Rome Hinterland Project, in which we try to hard merge 3 different survey data sets. The interesting, these are all for the area around Rome, and the interesting thing here is that these data sets are very different. They include the Tiber Valley Project dataset that is started in the 1950s. So in a sense, it's heritage data or legacy data collected in a different way from modern survey projects. The other one is the Suburbian Project from the Sapienza University of Rome. And they have a background in so-called topographic survey, so they have a different way of collecting data from the British School in Rome or from our own institute in the Netherlands. That's the third data set, by the way, the Pontine Region Project south of Rome. is an example of a modern, very intensive, systematic non-site survey. So these are very different types of data that you want to, or that we try to merge into a single new database. So that's what I call a hard merge. Then the second prong of the attack is through an ontology, the SHeRD ontology. So we're not trying to merge datasets, we're just trying to map them onto the same ontology. And that's being done in a project called the FAIR Surveys project since we started in 2016, and we recently published an article on the current status quo and are now in the process, together with George, of applying for funding to complete this. Thirdly, there's like a political prong to this, and that is to form an EAA community and working party in order to draft survey documentation guidelines. And that's relatively new, started in last year. And the idea here is mainly to drum up political support and to make it easier to create standards for survey documentation. Here's some detail about these approaches. I think most of this I already mentioned. So there's 3 different types of survey projects with very different ways of collecting data. And what we've been doing over the past year is, of course, creating a new database schema that is able to hold these 3 different data sets using a PostgreSQL PostGIS platform. And then creating all the definitions and mappings that are necessary in order to bring together these very disparate lists of period names, collection methods, various types of site attributes and finds attributes. Basically, the problem is that everybody describes their material in different ways, and how do you ever bring this to one standard of description? Well, there's basically a lot of expert knowledge goes into this process, and it turns out to be extremely time-consuming and therefore also expensive to do this. So personally, I think this is a dead-end approach. When you start adding more data sets, the problem just gets larger and larger. So I think this approach has sort of already reached its end of life, so to speak. However, it's interesting to see what kinds of problems we encountered, and these are fully documented on the GitHub page, and we will publish that so everybody can learn from this experience. And also the results, the merged database is going to be available from the servers of our university. So that's, I would say, probably this year it's going to be available for study by whoever is interested. And the publication, I should not forget to mention, in the European Journal of Archaeology is going to be to describe this system. So there are plans for a follow-up project to extend the database schema and add other data sets from across the Mediterranean. But as I said, personally, I think that the project is going to be running into larger and larger difficulties, because basically you're trying to force various different ways of describing data into the same mold. So the alternative, to me, what seemed to me the better alternative is the ontological approach, is where you describe the underlying set of concepts that underlies any type of fieldwalking survey, and then you ask data owners to map their data sets to this ontology. And as I understand, this has already been discussed in your group, so I don't need to go into any detail there. The current status of our work is published in folder survey. There's a link in my presentation. Maybe I saw somebody is posting the websites in the chat, so that's very good. As I said just now, we're currently applying for a Dutch research fund together with George and a company called Delving in order to complete this work, to have a full ontology for archaeological field survey and to demonstrate that it works on a few survey data sets in the next year or 2 years. Yeah, so I've got some details on the CRM survey extension, so I'm hoping that's also of interest to you. First of all, what we want to do is to, I should say what we first did, me and a colleague, is to construct a general process model, let's say an analysis of what we're actually doing when we're doing field survey, based on our own experience as survey directors, and then checking that against the experiences of many other survey directors that are in our networks. So the idea is that the process model should be valid for a large number of survey projects. And from the process model, a description of what we think we are doing during an archaeological survey, we produce a list of concepts that are being used in this process. And then, of course, those concepts then have to be mapped onto the concepts that are already in CDOC CRM, unless we find that a concept is missing, and then we add it to our own extension. So here is the list of fieldwalking concepts that we produced. This is by now already 2 or 3 years ago, I think. But it just gives you an idea of the types of things that are in here. I can share this file if you're interested to read this later on. But you can see there's about 20 concepts that we think we need. And of those concepts, a little bit over half, it turns out that we can map quite easily on existing CRM concepts. But of course, the interesting part is where we cannot map our survey concepts easily on the CRM. So here's just a very short list of the, let's say, the types of problems that we encountered and that still have to be solved. So let me just go through these bullets. Yeah, we struggled with how to model the activity of finds collection exactly. My personal view was that you can see the whole surface archaeological record as the population, and you're taking samples from these in various ways. They can be diagnostic samples or they can be spatial samples, but basically there's something physical present on the surface, and you're taking samples from that in order to extract some kind of information. And that suggests that we should be able to use an already existing concept of sample, which is in the CRM Sci extension. But then it turns out we can't use that because the definition of that sample is that it should be taking something material. I'm sorry, I should have prepared this better. Let me see. The CRM Sci concept of sample presupposes that the sample that you're taking is materially representative of the population. So the sample should have the same composition as the thing that you are sampling from, and this is the problem in the case of surveying that is not necessarily true. So we got a bit stuck there. Okay, so we can't use this particular concept of sample. So we have two options. Either we change this, we change the definition of that existing concept, or we add some kind of a new concept to the CRM. So this is a slight mismatch with existing concepts. Another type of problem is that what we regarded as a single concept of record taking turns out to map onto multiple existing CRM concepts. So how are we going to solve that? There are various ways in which you can take records. A third type of problem is the treatment of sites as something different from any normal survey unit. So a survey unit is a bit of space in which you conduct research, but a survey site is both a bit of space but also something else. It's like for example, generally a survey site is some kind of settlement or some kind of activity that you are investigating. So taking a sample from a site or taking a sample from a survey unit are two different things, or can be two different things, which leads to a problem in the ontology because a survey site is a material thing. It's a group of objects forming the site together, and therefore it has a material component, and you can remove parts from that. However, a survey unit is a bit of space from which you cannot remove any parts. So the problem for us was that exactly the same activity, that is taking some objects from the field, turns out you have to model it in two different ways, depending on whether you are taking it from a site or from a survey unit. And we didn't like that. Another more fundamental problem is that if you're doing a field survey and not finding anything, how do you model that in CDOC CRM? It turns out there is no provision for this, let's say, negative observation yet. So that requires a quite fundamental change to the CRM. And finally, there is also a CRM Archaeo extension, which is geared towards excavation. And obviously, we want our survey set of concepts to fit with the concepts developed for CRM Archaeo. So that leads to the problem, can we define what we do as surveyors as just investigating one particular layer? Or should we regard the Earth's surface as some kind of interface between layers? So this is put here as a question because we haven't decided yet. So this, I think, this together gives you a very good idea of, let's say, the kinds of questions that we still have when creating this survey CRM. And hopefully, if we get the funding for this new project, we are able to resolve all of these problems in the near future. So here is just details of this new project. We're trying to use the Dutch Science Foundation Open Science funding call with a maximum of 50,000 euros. And we plan to partner with George and with a company called delving.eu to resolve, well, the issues in the previous slide. And in that way to complete the harmonized CRM survey extension. Also, of course, use in collaboration with the special interest group on conceptual reference modeling. But not only that, we also want to demonstrate that this system is actually functional by having this company Delving produce a mapper tool that allows actual test data sets to be mapped and converted to RDF. and then served as linked open data. So that we can demonstrate to the world that this system is actually functional.
Could you say in more detail or a little bit more about what problems you ran into before you went for the ontological approach?
Yes, well, let's say chronologically, both approaches were started more or less at the same time. And the hard merger approach is a consequence of us obtaining another grant from the Dutch National Science Foundation to do this hard merger of 3 data sets. Let me see. Your question was the problems that we ran into with that. Okay. So, first of all, the first set of problems is obviously the quality of the input data sets. There's I don't know about yours, but the data sets that I'm familiar with, they have lots of inconsistencies. For example, it goes from simple spelling mistakes to, let's say, data types that don't belong in the database fields that they're in, information that's hidden in nodes fields and therefore not directly accessible. So basically, you discover that more or less every data set that you work with is a mess that has to be cleaned up first. But after you've done that, then the next stage is the definitions of the things that are described in the data set. So if you take, for example, site types, every project has some kind of list of site types, but generally those are not defined. There are no criteria for deciding which site type to use as interpretation. And there's no, basically, you cannot know whether what one project calls a villa is the same thing as what another project calls a villa, unless you go very deeply and you actually ask the dataset owners in an interview exactly what they mean by this. But then it turns out that very often these things are very vague, poorly defined. So how do you force these possibly different things into the same type in the end? There's a lot of wishy-washy interpretation and decisions that goes into that. So what we did was we built a hierarchy of site types on top of this. So if we didn't have enough information from the source data set, then we would classify the source the source site type into some kind of higher group of sites, broader group, so that we could be sure at least it fits in there, even though we don't have any detailed definition of the thing itself. Let me see what other things, other differences are. Well, let's say the well-published pottery types that have a typology tended to be relatively easy, but most of what we find in surveys is not in one of those very well-defined types. So we have lots of local pottery types, coarse wares and stuff that actually is the bulk of what we find, and that can be only very poorly dated and is generally very poorly described as well. So that's one thing that we're still struggling with. How can we include those non-diagnostic pots into our merged database in a meaningful way?
I have a question, if I'm not interrupting anybody else. I mean, a thing that's a common aspect that comes up in a conversation with archaeologists, if you talk about CRM Archeo, is that it's very nice that you can semantically or ontologically represent this data and possibly integrate it with something, but I'm not really, it's not something I need. I'm just going to use my excavation data for that excavation and I don't need to do a comparison or merge with other excavation data. I was wondering, so I wanted to ask you the benefits that you see, aside from good scholarship and so on, to the arriving at the point where this EAA group you talk about in terms of setting up protocols has gone down the path and has set up good things where good procedures and so on, and people are following them more or less, and then the CRM survey exists and there are easy tools to map your data into that. Then what research possibilities do you see that enabling?
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that question is much easier to answer for survey data than for excavation data, because there I do agree that it's difficult to see how you could, by extracting, for example, stratigraphical information from multiple sites. So let's say, what interesting question could be answered by that. But in the case of survey, we're actually all investigating the same thing, the surface archaeological records of the world. And therefore, any type of question that is, for example, about a larger area than our own particular survey study area, automatically wants to use and combine data from multiple survey projects. So in the case of this hard merger project, we already started defining the types of questions that we want to ask about this database. So you can, for example, ask, okay, how did this particular type of pot spread over the landscape, or in other words, the consumption of that pot spread over the landscape? Did it follow, for example, infrastructure? Can we tie it to the certain points on the coast where that are the foci of the importation, if we're talking about foreign types of pots? But we can also look at the, let's say, changes in the social fabric of society. If we can say, for example, that the penetration of villa type sites into the mountains can be traced chronologically. So you can say, okay, it happened earlier in this area and later in that area, or the densities are different in one part of the landscape from another part of the landscape. So this is also because my background is in GIS. My questions tend to be spatial, whereas other people, like, for example, economic historians, are more interested in changes in the character of the assemblage. For example, is the percentage of imported ware rising or falling over time? That tells something about the economic integration of the particular site or area. So I think we've hardly scratched the surface there. The problem is that basically nobody ever asked this type of question, because it's completely impossible to use all these disparate data sets. And it's only when the data become, let's say, comparable, or that you can seriously start to analyze them.